It's time for Johnny and the Professor. Common sense in senseless times.
I'm not a Republican, but if I was, I would be extremely concerned about censorship in social media, which is a real thing. Censorship of Republican ideas and conservative ideas is absolutely a real thing. It's not just real, it's accepted as being the right thing to do by certain organizations. I mean, they've been caught on camera and hidden camera talking about the ways that you can silence conservative voices. For sure, conservatives are being discriminated against on social media by social media platforms. And even if you're not banning them from those platforms, if you're shadow banning them, if you're making it very difficult for people to find them, which is real. It's a real thing that they do. Like if you have a post on social media, it doesn't just go up in chronological order anymore. Now it's affected by an algorithm. They can, in certain social media platforms, use that algorithm to discriminate. So they can decide, hey, this guy keeps chirping on and on about Hillary Clinton's war crimes and all this. We don't need this guy around, okay? We don't need this guy and all of his right-wing bull and all his Make America Great Again bull. So we'll shadow ban him. And so they can shove you into this category where it's very difficult to find your page. And it's very difficult for you to show up. And a lot of people have seen their views drop drastically. There's a woman named Megan Murphy. Well, on Twitter, she wrote, "A man is never a woman." They told her she has to take down that tweet. So you know what she did? She made a screenshot of it. She took down that tweet, and then she posted a picture of the screenshot. And then they banned her for life. You know who's not banned for life? O.J. Simpson. Double homicide, armed kidnapping. He's fine. But this lady who's just said a man is never a woman, which biologically is correct.
Johnny and the Professor.
And another exciting episode of Johnny and the Professor.
Common sense for senseless times.
Where we talk politics, pop culture, and I didn't think of a P word. Give me a P word. How's that?
How about partisanship?
Okay.
There's a lot of that
getting
going on.
fancy now.
Ooh. Yeah.
So do you want to introduce our guest? You're our guest introducer.
Is that what I do here? I wondered what I was doing here.
Well, you're better at it than I am. So.
Okay, well, our guest last week we had on Jim Walsh, and this week we have on his counterpart, of course, which is Representative Brian Blake.
Welcome to the show.
Well, happy to be here. I'm excited to find out what this is all about.
Nobody's listening anyway, so it doesn't matter.
Well, that's not true because I've had people tell me that they hear our show.
No way.
Well,
really?
Jim said his wife listens to it.
So there's one.
At least have one. Well, welcome to the show. I know that you're a hunter. That you're definitely a sportsman interested in our ecology of Washington, and I was wondering about what you think about some of the ideas like the Wild Olympics, and some of the other factors on how to regulate and handle the forests in Washington.
Yeah, the Wild Olympics, I was interested in that before it was Wild Olympics. There was a group called Olympic Wild that I found on the internet, and I thought, who are these people and what are they trying to do? And I happened to travel back to Washington, D.C., and actually had an audience with the chief of the Forest Service and asked about Olympic Wild, and thought they knew nothing about it. They told me, and I got back to Washington, and about 2 weeks later, I thought, well, let's see what Olympic Wild's up to, and it was gone. And I thought that's interesting. And then it was several months after that the Wild Olympics campaign started, and don't know if there was a connection between that conversation in D.C. and the disappearance of Olympic Wild, but the Olympics, both the national park and the national forest and the private lands surrounding it are a special place to me. As a child, I hiked into the Seven Lakes Basin, and what an amazing place. And I've spent a lot of time recreating on the national forest. As you said, I'm a hunter. Really enjoyed Matheny Ridge, Sam's River, and so I try to stop in on those places every once in a while and just spend some time there. It's very calming, so to speak, and Haven't hunted up there in a while. We did switch and start hunting the West Fork of the Hump Tulips. And so, the bottom line is, when I saw the first Wild Olympics bill, I was not happy. I think the forest management program of the Olympic National Forest has been virtually shut down. There's some work being done, some thinning, which I support, and but I'm a little frustrated that the limitations on the thinning. I think there certainly was a case to be made that we had harvested the old growth at a rate that was unsustainable, and but then the pendulum swung, and the Northwest Forest Plan virtually shut down the forestry program. Like I say, there's some thinning going on, but they set artificial limitations in my mind about what elevation you can do that thinning. In Brian Blake's opinion, any of those previously managed units, industrial-sized clear cuts that have been replanted in Douglas fir and hemlock, should have re-entry at some point and manage the stem density. And from my view, it looks like they're precluding that. Jump the gun. I mentioned Sam's River. The 2180 road was a special place to me, and they have proposed some thinning projects there again and again and been stopped. And then later they came in and destroyed the road access to the 2180 bridge, the Sam's River Bridge, which would have been a beautiful location for just a small, non-intrusive campground. And there's a huge concrete bridge there, some falls, and they went in and destroyed that access. And I was very disappointed. Spent hours of my life working on travel waste management plans with the Forest Service on the adjacent Matheny Ridge, and we had great plans for some loop trails that would make the landscape accessible. Again, they came in and, in my opinion, maliciously destroyed that opportunity, and so it's been. Just had some bad experiences with federal agencies. I was hunting at one point on the Sam's River and heard a vehicle pull up, and so I got out of the rack and out the door, and here comes a Parks federal officer with his hand on his gun. Never removed his hand off his gun the whole time we talked, and he again, we're on national forest land. This is National Park Ranger. And he told me that we were blocking the road. And I said, yes, we are. And he said, you can't do that. And I said, no, it's okay, we can. The Forest Service encourages dispersed camping. And he said, asked who I'd talked to, and I told him the district ranger. And I said, the road's washed out, 80 yards down the hill. He says, I know that. And finally he got a little frustrated, and he says, if there's a fire in the park, he says, I'm going to get a bulldozer and push your trailer off in the brush. And I said, if there's a fire in the park, get me a bulldozer and I'll push it off into the brush. And he's still with his hand on his gun. He just kind of glared and turned and never removed his hand from his gun until he got in his vehicle and drove off. Wow. And it was just...
It's the classic argument of that most people can deal with failure in their life, but the worst thing you can do to a human being is give them power. Because when a human gets power, that's a true test of whether or not they have any character at all. And this gentleman sounds like he has a little power and therefore is abusing it.
Yeah.
And that almost sounds like we were talking here about this Wild Olympics. I mean, I've been reading on it, and they're saying that there will be no impact in timber jobs. There'll be no impact economically on the state from their own web informations. And obviously that's not the case.
Well, Actually, it's pretty accurate. With the Northwest Forest Plan, the plan is to end all those forest jobs already. So they're right in saying the Wild Olympics would not have an impact because the overall plan is to eliminate all those jobs.
And yet you have all these trees that could be, and Washington has been traditionally a timber-producing state. Why are we eliminating our ability to produce timber then?
Well, that gets even more complicated. You go back into the 90s and the creation of REITs and TIMOs.
Okay.
Real Estate Investment Trust and Timber Investment Management Organizations. And that's for private investments. And Wall Street did not want the competition of public timber. And so they wanted to lock up as much public timber as possible to protect their investments.
But no consideration for the state itself or the people, or the fact that the forests belong to the people of Washington, and that, you know, if you own private land, don't you have the right to harvest your timber off of it?
No, so that the private guys are still harvesting.
Okay.
This is about the national forest.
The national forest. Okay, I got you.
Yeah, and so it's frustrating to me. And I think we had this broad timber market, very big, public timber, private timber, and it kind of we had mills all over Western Washington, and this change happened. Is wrong, in my opinion. That said, that was done. Okay, let's move forward. Everybody says let's move to a recreation economy, but they refuse to invest in. Remember, I talked about the Matheny Trail,
the trails. If you're
some campgrounds,
people can't actually go there and use the facilities. How do you have a recreational income coming in from that? Right,
and so that's my frustration. And I don't want to paint it as there's some good stuff happening. There's been some thinning projects in the lower levels of the West Fork of the hump tulips. They're talking about doing some thinning in the lower levels of the Wainuchi. Simultaneously, while they destroy the opportunity to do some thinning in the upper reaches of both those regions. And that's my frustration. Let's think long term here. Maybe these roads are not going to be needed in the future, but let's make them into a trail system, and people can disperse. And the old road to Discovery Lake and Discovery Peak, that's not going to be a road again, but let's invest a little into making that a trail. There's some washouts there that need some work, and let's make this land accessible to the people and put people to work doing that, a different kind of forestry job.
Exactly. I mean, thinning is obviously a work that people can do, and it makes the forests more healthy. People always have this idea that you're not, if forests are not to be touched. I go, if you don't touch a forest, nature will burn it every once in a while and thin it out itself. It does it for a reason, because if it grows and grows and grows, it will choke down. You'll get to the point where your ground cover gets so dense that your trees can be destroyed. Whereas a normal burn, I mean, most forests, if a burn goes through an area where you have you have large older trees, they're not going to burn down. They're just going to survive, and the area will be more nutrition in the soil now. It grows better. But yet we have this idea that we can't touch it at all, and if it burns, we have to stop it. We can't do anything.
Well, and that's where I've had a couple hearings in my committee. The science is finally catching up, and I don't want to be here to bash the Forest Service or the Park Service or others. It's all our response. We all grew up with the Smokey the Bear campaign.
Oh, I know.
So what we've learned actually is that by unnaturally removing fire from the landscape, we have created these catastrophic conditions. Had we understood the benefits of fire, and worked with fire on the landscape, we'd be in a much better and different position right now.
And have a healthier forest.
Yeah, the ecologists that we had come into the committee have got this figured out, and we're in a bad place. And as far as conditions for catastrophic fire, I mean, none of us here were alive for the 1910 fire there over in Montana and northern Idaho, but
Right.
that fire swept through there and created enough force that it literally rooted trees, live trees, out of the ground and tossed them miles ahead of the fire, and kept perpetuating the fire. And now the peninsula here is a little bit different in that we're so wet. It's very rare for those catastrophic fires
Exactly.
here on the peninsula. Probably had a fire cycle of the large catastrophic fires every 800 years or so, and they didn't burn the entire landscape, and they created a mosaic. And so when we got here, there was large stands of old growth Douglas fir, other stands of hemlock. Hemlock regenerates in another way. It
Right.
regenerates in wind throw events.
Yes.
And so we had, in my lifetime, I remember the Columbus Day storm. I don't remember the 21 blow, but it was a very similar storm, and the 1880 coastal gale. And I called a professor after I started seeing these dates, and I said, is there something about a 40-year kind of cycle for these catastrophic storms on the Washington coast? And nah, they're just storms. But we do seem to have these big storms that put down a lot of timber. And of course, the 07 storm. I don't know if you were here. I'm sure Johnny was here, but that was a whole different class of storm. I mean, that blew for 3 days.
Oh, I know. I lived in Aberdeen. They had power for 3 days.
Yeah, and it was amazing forces. And then we have other forces that work on forest, these silver thaws, where we'll get ice forming in trees. I don't know if you've been out in the woods after a big silver thaw, but the destruction
No, haven't.
of those trees just being so heavy that they snap off. And so there's a lot of forces that created the forest that were here when we got here. And don't get me wrong, I love wilderness, and I seek out wilderness when I can get there. And I just don't believe the majority of what the Wild Olympics campaign wants to designate as wilderness is wilderness.
And when we're talking with Jim about it last week, he mentioned the idea of being good stewards of the earth, but understanding that it's much more complicated than simple issues. People, that's what you're saying, that you're now. I like the fact you mentioned ecologists, which is what I think of myself as, because I go back to the ecologists of the 1970s, and when we're talking about the ecology and understanding it, then all of a sudden everyone turned green, where now it's a slogan rather than looking at the overall picture, and looking at the bigger image of what needs to be done. And I think and you strike me definitely as a man who understands the value of the ecology as compared to the soundbite.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm one of those odd folks who, as I'm driving down a county road, says, "Well, look at that! All native plants in that community." And then I get to another section, and there's the Scotch bloom, or
I hate the Scotch bloom,
or the knotweed, and other things. And it's like, that just doesn't belong there. And so. There's work to be done, and there's some good things happening. We talked earlier off the air about the difference between conservation and preservation.
Exactly.
And there's a place for both, and I appreciate that. But I think we, in my opinion, manipulate the folks. And I got into politics over the Elk River Natural Area Preserve, and felt like folks were kind of pulling the wool over our eyes and using language. There's a plan out there, and I can't think of the name of it right. Henderson's checker mallow.
Okay.
And they said, well, we've got to put this in a natural area preserve because this Henderson's checker mallow is a Class 3 monitor species. Well, that sounds pretty ominous, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah.
You know what the definition of a Class 3 monitor species?
No, I'm sorry.
Less abundant or less endangered and or more abundant than previously assumed.
Okay.
So it's not as ominous now. It's like, oh, it's everywhere. And we were just scared that it wasn't everywhere. And so we've got to... That said, the Elk River is a beautiful place. I spent a day this spring just out there laying in the salt marsh munching on pickleweed, and because I couldn't get to where I wanted to do my work. But it's a beautiful place, and it deserves to be conserved. You know, and we have a lot of that here. I mean, the upside is out here on the coast, we've done a pretty darn good job in protecting the right places, and I think we have a lot to be proud of. I mean, I think it's over 25% of Puget Sound has been bulkheaded. The shoreline's bulkheaded and hardened, and that's a problem.
Oh, yeah, because of erosion, obviously.
Yeah.
But again, erosion's natural process, except we happen to be living there, and our houses fall in the ocean, and people don't like that.
Right. That erosion and that feeds that shoreline, and a lot of the forage fish, the candlefish and the surf smelt and some of the other things tend to breed in that habitat, and so we're losing that, and that's in many cases why salmon in Puget Sound are endangered.
I'm just thrilled that, being more on a conservative show, you're willing to come on and talk with us and have a dialogue instead of name-calling each other and I don't want to go there. I'm just glad you're here to talk.
I got into this because I got in loggerheads with a group called the Nature Conservancy. And the guy is by the name of Elliot Marks, and a statewide elected Democrat in Jennifer Belcher. And I think they dismissed and refused to listen to what our community was saying. The community was always saying, we want to conserve Elk River. We just don't want to be locked out of there. The position of the state at the time was, well, you have to get a permit. And the only way you can get a permit is if you're a scientist or an educator. And I'm like, well, that's kind of silly. I just want to go out there and pick berries. No, you can't do that. And the public saw how ridiculous that was, and the legislature changed the law, and that's the story of how Brian Blake got in the legislature. I saw that you could make change as a citizen, with Sid Snyder and Mark Domet and Brian Hatfield and Jim Buck and others. Very naive about the partisan process at that point, but I saw you could make change, and it was exciting. And that led me to working with Jay Sterling on the trail on the south side of the Chehalis at the Chehalis River Surge Plain Natural Area Preserve.
We're talking with Representative Brian Blake. More coming up on Johnny and the Professor.
You're listening to Johnny and the Professor. Politics,
This is actually what makes this whole thing so comical.
pop culture,
This is something that they're going to be prioritizing, and that is diversity. Now, this is stupid.
common sense in senseless times. This is Johnny and the Professor. Common sense in senseless times.
All of the people who are ascribed to this liberal, progressive ideology, the people at the pool who didn't like that you were reading my book, Deborah Messing, she's another Hollywood hypocrite. She wants to know who's attending a Trump fundraiser so that then they can let their producers know or directors know the people they don't want to work with. This is McCarthyism. We have free speech in this country. We are allowed to vote for whomever we want. But the hate is so intense. They have a plot to remake America, to shut down the right, to make sure that we can get as many legals coming in as 144,000 in 1 month. Give them a license and let them vote.
Contact the show at jpshowfm@gmail.com.
It's Johnny and the Professor, and we have Representative Brian Blake in the studio today.
There's a larger issue that, and we have this in Washington as in D.C. too, that it seems to be in our federal government, is again, you're talking about bureaucracies versus elected officials. And again, there's that, we talked about power. I mentioned the idea earlier, and that you have these people that they're unelected, but they get in these positions of power, and they get very proprietary. And then to exist, they have to make sure their budgets justify their actions. And it seems to me that you can, as a lawmaker, as a person, a legislative individual, and that strikes me as one of the big problems we seem to have in the United States in general, is our bureaucracies are unelected versus our electeds trying to actually make changes and do things in this country.
Yeah, it's had the experience on the Rainbow Creek Road here. The road dead ends at what was called the Fish Trap. It's on my gazetteer as a boat launch. Folks have been launching boats of some type there for probably 80 years. And the Forest Service came in and said, we're going to destroy that access. And we said, why? And they said, well, there's a little tiny rivulet of water here, and salmon may come up into the swamp, baby salmon, and seek refuge. And later that water changed and entered the river in another place, but they were so invested. It had nothing to do with salmon and that rivulet. It had all to do with destroying vehicle access to that gravel bar, so you couldn't launch a boat there. And it didn't matter if their argument was valid or not. They were going to destroy that access. And I know Washington state law does not apply to the federal government. I get that. But the Washington state law does not allow a local government or state government to vacate a road that goes to the waters of the state. And that's the feeling, that's the policy of the people of Washington. That's what we value, is that the public can access our water. And again, so it was odd to me that they are still fighting so hard to keep that access blocked. They will say, well, it's illegal. The forester looked me in the eye and he said, well, here's the deal, Brian. There's a gravel bar downstream. While I'm in charge here, he says, it's illegal to drive on a gravel bar, but while I'm in charge, I'll make sure you can still illegally drive on this lower gravel bar. But we'll destroy access up here. Is that okay? And I said, no, that's not okay.
Because you don't have the power to do that.
Yeah.
You're either breaking the law or not.
Yeah.
Show me the law.
Show me the. To this day, they've never shown me the law. It's all personal agenda.
And I think that's, if we don't, it's funny, this goes way back to, from a historical point of view, you can go back into the 1800s and talk about the Pendleton Act, which was an act that dealt with the bureaucracies of who could be the hiring and firing in the federal government. This is American history going back a ways, but it's the same idea that you have these people, they get into these jobs, and generally a lot of them are political appointees. Sometimes they don't even have to, for goodness sake, people are doing these jobs what are your criteria? Do you have any background? Have you ever studied what you're doing to do this? And they get in there and they get these positions, and then they abuse their power, and they become more of a hindrance to the people, rather than, because we can't get rid of them as voters. We can't get rid of them because we're electing people like you, but you can't get rid of them. We elect congressmen and senators in Washington, but they don't want to get rid of them. They have these massive bloated bureaucracies that are simply sustaining themselves. I honestly don't know if in some ways I think that's a greater threat to some of our freedoms in this country than anything else anyone else is doing.
Yeah, it's there's and I don't want to, generalize. There's a lot of good people.
Oh, I agreed. I agree with that also.
Both the federal and state governments. And Vicki Christensen, who's now chief of the Forest Service, I think she's a good leader, and I trust her not to be overboard. And she and I have a history. She used to be the state forester here in Washington, and going back to the Surge Plain Natural Area Preserve, the Preacher Slough Road was there, and they wanted to destroy that road, and so I said no, and they came up with all these different. Well, it's the RMAP, the Road Maintenance and Abandonment Planning, and I said RMAP doesn't apply to this road, and finally had no luck with the lower level employees, so I had Vicki on the phone, and she went the RMAP route, and I said, Vicki, this is a Grays Harbor County road, and if you're telling me that all county gravel roads, RMAP applies, I've got 38 counties in this state that I've got to call now. If you want me to start calling counties and letting them know that RMAP applies to their gravel roads, and she's like, let me call you back. And she called me back and said, no, RMAP doesn't apply. It was, there's good people. You know, I've had similar discussions with the Corps of Engineers out at the Redmond Slough. We were trying to figure out a way to restore that slough in a way, and we were going to remove a couple beaver dams and kind of restore. The hope is to restore that tidal flow, and put in for a permit. The Corps of Engineers told the guy, nope, that requires that's you can't get that on the there's a name for it, nationwide permit, because it's too much volume. And I said, we're just gonna knock out a couple beaver dams here. And I said, you've given State Parks is gonna dredge 200 yards downstream, and you gave them a blanket permit. And he says, oh, let me and then we had a discussion about how I could accomplish my goals and meet their needs. And so there's good people out there that if you make logical arguments to them, will find a way. So I don't want to blanket.
Well, and I agree. You can't. Don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. There are a lot of good people, but sometimes I think I definitely think we have a bloated bureaucracy in the United States. We have more people doing things, probably having jobs that are just filling seats. And again, that's still a use of power. And I get nervous about it when I've got some person who is telling you, we'll bend the law for you.
Yeah.
Well, you don't have the right to bend the law. The law is the law. I mean, and again, it seems to me that I don't see a solution to this problem.
Which brings me to another story.
Okay.
The state agencies and not posting the law. I was on a field trip in eastern Washington, and on some public land, state land, and there was a sign that said, "This activity is prohibited." Okay. What law prohibits it? Well, I don't know. We just put up a sign that says it's prohibited. I said, wouldn't it be nice if you put based on RCW,
right,
blah, 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 or WAC, WAC? And they said, well, yeah, that, and it kept being a problem, so I ran a bill that said, if you're going to say X activity is prohibited on this state land, just list the authority that prohibits the activity. And they all came to me, said, Brian, just don't pass that bill. We promise all future signs. We don't want to have to. I said, I don't want you wasting money on replacing good signs, but your future policy should be that you put this on your signs. Now, I did notice out at Ocean Shores, I haven't seen the sign physically yet, and it's not my district, but they DNR and Parks put up a big gaudy sign, And from what I could see of the picture online, I couldn't see any RCW or WAC authority anywhere on that sign. And so I've been meaning to drive out there and actually take a look and see if there's anything been put on there. So I have reintroduced the bill. I reintroduced it late last year. I haven't given it a hearing yet, but I'm hoping that the agencies will hold to their commitment.
It's almost like they're little lords or the little fiefdoms, and they just are going to make their rules. And why should we have to actually say why we can do this? I mean, well, I'm sorry, you're right. I have freedom in this country, and till the law tells me I'm doing something I can't be, I get to pretty much do whatever I want until I run into the impinging on the rights of others, or I run into the law. Yeah. I mean, it strikes me as common sense. But again, you're talking about common sense thinking patterns, and I'm not sure there's a reason we say, common sense for senseless times. I think that there's a lot of just insanity in the world, in this country, rolling around from people that are so caught up in their own views and realities, they don't look at the world around them in a bigger picture.
Yeah, it was, I'm on some group. We were at a meeting. It was the drought committee. We were in Eastern Washington, and the ecology was testifying about how they were running a bill. I'm actually the sponsor of the bill, and the guy was testifying how they needed to do this bill because they had a WAC rule that had no authority in RCW. That's the thing, a WAC rule has to come from some authority that we've given them. And
right.
So there he was in front of the world on TV saying, yeah, our WAC rule has no authority in law, but it's our WAC rule, and so we're going to try and pass a bill after the fact that gives us the authority to have the rule that we're applying. And so I had to ask, and I said, do you do that often, where you adopt rules and laws that have no authority? He backtracked and covered up his tracks pretty good, but
or in that case it might be whack tracking, right?
Whack tracking, yeah.
We're wacky, all right.
Yeah, we're definitely falling to that criteria. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. I've learned more about the green aspects of this state than I think in the last 45 minutes than I have in the 15 years I've been here before. But it's good to know. The people need to be aware of it. I mean, we have a very green state. When I moved up here, I'm a transplant from California.
Boo.
Yes, boo. Yeah, but we've been here about 15 years now. But I mean, what amazed me when I pulled into Washington was all the different shades of green. Because I lived in the Central Valley in California, which is a beautiful shade of beige in the summertime because everything turns brown and dead.
Right.
Fresno, hotter than the door hinges of hell. But yeah, so which is why I get up here and laugh when people, because they say it's hot in the summer and it's in the 90s, and I laugh at them because I'm 118 degrees in Fresno sometimes. But I was amazed how green it was and all the different shades. And I don't think people up here appreciate it as much as they probably should, that we have these wonderful resources in this state, and we need to conserve them and be good stewards of them. But that means people should have a right to be able to use them.
Yeah, it's a beautiful state we live in, and we have some challenges, but let's let the people access our state, and that's I'm just a recreational advocate in these water access sites. We got the 7400 opened up on the Wainuchi. Thank you, Fish and Wildlife. There may be an announcement in the near future about another access site on the Wainuchi, but I'll let them announce that if that work gets done.
No spoilers. No
spoilers. And Fish and Wildlife is working hard. We saw a challenge up the Wishkah on a boating access site, and made some phone calls, and bada bing, bada boom, and that boat launch is back open. Thank you to both Fish and Wildlife and a wonderful private landowner. That's a leased site. That landowner could tell us to take a hike, get out of here. But we that's the other side of this coin is we have a proud history of private land ownership in this state, and we need to honor and respect these private landowners, both large and small, and work with them so they can meet their goals, and yet we can have access. And I grew up in the golden age where I could go anywhere. As soon as I got my driver's license, I could drive for all day and never see civilization. And across land ownerships, private land ownerships, and those days are gone, and I don't think we'll ever see them back. But I think there's I worked with Fish and Wildlife. They brought me a bill, and it will allow them to we passed the bill. It will allow them to work with private landowners to find out what are their needs. This is your land. What do you need from us to find a way to allow the public to recreate on your land and still meet your goals for your property? And it's a little underfunded right now, the agency is, but I hope over time we can get the agency fully funded, and they can continue working on these private access programs and get the public back on the landscape.
It sounds like a very good idea. I commend you on that. It's admirable. Well, I think we're probably about out of time here.
About there.
So, generally, in the end, do you have anything you particularly want to tell about any projects or anything the last few minutes before we're...
I was just out at Washaway Beach, and my father's grade school that he went to is about 1.5 miles out in the ocean. There was the Coast Guard station that was there had been moved 3 times, and
cemetery too, right?
Yeah, cemetery was moved, and a real problem, and the erosion was continuing, and so out of the blue, state agencies stepped up and said, Representative, we could probably help with some money here, and I have to say thank you, Fish and Wildlife, Ecology, State Parks, the Conservation Commission, the Pacific County Conservation District, the Pacific County Drainage District number 1, and the Shoalwater Bay Tribe. The amazing work, and we have put in a dynamic berm. And I had never heard of a dynamic berm until about 3 years ago, and it's in. I think they're going to do some maintenance this week, and the erosion has been slowed.
You're never going to win against it, but you can slow
Now,
it.
was it the jetty that caused that? When we put that jetty in, I think it's the North Jetty, the jetty in Westport.
I'm not willing to say one thing caused this. This erosion started in 1870.
Oh, okay.
And I've got, if you come to my office in Olympia, I have a really cool drawing that shows the erosion over time. Mm-hmm. And the diagram starts in about 1870 when there was the full North Cove.
Right.
And by the time I was a kid, it was pretty far up, and I've heard a lot of theories. I've heard, the Columbia River Dam stopped a lot of material from being pushed out, and then the tides and winds pushed sand up to the north, and then other currents during the summer. I think the north winds would blow that sand, and I think created the some people say it was the European dune grass that was then planted to stabilize the sands,
right?
Mm-hmm. And so the process quit. Here we are, we're in a 10,000 years ago, the Pacific Ocean was approximately 400 feet lower than it is today. We're in a relatively, it's recent history that we're even in the situation we're in.
Well, I know.
Now, if you look at that, use those numbers, you say, well, the ocean rose 4 feet a century over the last 10,000 years. And you think, wow, well, the trick with that is it rose very quickly and then tapered off.
Right, exactly.
And we got to the what we know. But 10,000 years ago, the coast was 20 years offshore.
Right.
and the temperature of the Earth was dramatically different than it is now. And then we have, again, this one thing we recently been talking about is that people want to try to understand the idea of how the Earth works and its ecosystem, yet in the Roman period, it was hotter than it is now. Then it was colder during the Dark Age. Then it was warmer during the Middle Ages. Then we had the Little Ice Age. And now we're in another warming period. People seem to have...
Global warming! It's climate change! We're going to die in 12 years!
But it's only... I mean, I'm only talking a couple thousand years. And yet we've had all these fluctuations. And yet people seem to have... This is back to the idea of being ecologists. Look at the bigger picture of things before you immediately declare one thing to be an issue. I mean, that seems to be the short-sightedness we're talking about, the bureaucracies. They'll see one thing, and they'll not realize that there's 100 things interrelated to that you have to have people that know what they're doing. You can't just blow smoke and assume that unless you have just a political agenda or, to accomplish things. Anyway, I think that's a good. We're pretty close to a wrap. Should we say in the end?
Got enough for a program.
Oh yeah, enough.
Yeah.
Well, we don't like to edit for content, but we may have to edit for time.
For time, yeah.
Because we try to keep the good. We'll keep the good stuff and take out the breaths and all that, and the does.
I stutter and ums and uhs a lot, so I usually take a lot of that out.
I get too many ums and uhs too. I notice. But so you want an end thing on it here?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so I want to thank you for being. It's okay to call you Brian. I assume.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Make sure.
I prefer that.
All right. Well.
No, you're a racist, toxic male.
Yeah, I'm a toxic male. What can I say?
Just don't call me late for dinner.
Yeah. Well, that's the truth. That's not a problem I have. Well, Brian, I want to thank you for being here today. It was very informative and very interesting, and we hope you'll come back and see us again in the future.
Absolutely.
It wasn't so bad.
No.
Being here? Okay.
No, I'm fascinated by these discussions. I don't think that we have enough forums to talk about this stuff, not in a controversial way or confrontational way, but hear my perspective. And there's other people that have a different perspective on Wild Olympics. I get that. They're good people. My good friend Derek Kilmer is the sponsor of the bill, and I support Derek on other stuff he does. We just have this disagreement.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, that'll do it.
Okay. Do you want me to wrap in on the end that?
Go for it.
I always have. This is just end stuff with it. So if you have any questions or comments, you send them to our email address, which is jpshowfm@gmail.com, and of course you go to YouTube and look up Johnny and the Professor, and all of our shows are posted there with nice video backgrounds to keep you amused. And also, of course, I do articles for the Senior Sunset Times.
You're listening to Johnny and the Professor. Politics.
This is actually what makes this whole thing so comical.
Pop culture.
This is something that they're going to be prioritizing, and that is diversity. Now, this is stupid.
Common sense in senseless times.